without further ado, I would like to introduce Joni van der Sam from MenEngage Alliance. She's actually a co-director, and if you would like to know more about the organization she is leading, you can go to their website. And I'm sure Joni will talk about the organization a bit more.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Milena. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm so happy to see all of you here, at least your names, not your faces, but you're very, very welcome to put your camera on if you want to. And maybe in the chat, if you have access to share your name, where you're calling in from, and yeah, maybe share anything about your interest in the topic, what brings you here today. It would be really lovely for me, and I think for everybody to hear. Yeah, so Milena reached out. Actually, we were connected many years ago, and she said at some point she might want to invite me to have a conversation with you all. And one of the things that she shared with me is that that in your group or the group that she's been organizing, there's really been a challenge in promoting EDI in earth sciences and lack of male participation in those efforts, both as presenters and in the participants and the audience. So yeah, I work on engaging men and boys in gender equality, gender justice, and social justice issues. I'm a co-director of MenEngage Alliance, as Milena shared. I share the leadership with another colleague, and we are the directors of a team of people that work all around the world. And I'll share more about MenEngage Alliance as we move forward. But really, what Milena asked me to share about is, yeah, to think collectively about understanding the problem around, you know, lack of male involvement and how we may be able to tackle it. And I have to say that mobilizing men and boys for social justice issues is a challenge. It's not easy. And if you look at the feminist movement, which I consider myself part of, and increasingly the intersectional feminist movement, that movement really stands for social justice and human rights for everybody, for all of us, kind of regardless of your gender identity, your sexual orientation, your race, your age. It's really about inclusion and rights and well-being for everyone. And yet at the same time, you see that the feminist movement is still largely, well, led by women, which I think that makes sense. It came from the women's rights movement. But also, yeah, most participants are either female identified or LGBTQI people, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, intersectional, and asexual people. So you do see that there is a challenge to engage what we call cisgender men. But they do exist. There are definitely men involved in this work, and I want to share with you a little bit about that work that we do. So if you could show the next slide, Milena. And what I'll be talking about today, I'll start with sharing a bit about what MenEngage Alliance is and does. I'll do a little bit of theorizing around the personal is political, and I'll get back to that a couple of times during the conversation today. And then we'll dive into ways how men can be engaged in gender justice. So kind of some really concrete ways that I experience in my work and that I would like to share with you. And we'll dig into thinking through what makes someone an activist, practical ways to engage men and boys diversity and intersectionality, transforming patriarchal systems, and the right and the smart thing to do. And then I'll end with an invitation to men. And while we're on this conversation, if you want to share anything in the chat, any thoughts you have, any questions that you have, please do so. It would be lovely also to hear from you. And if you could show the next slide. So here I want to talk with you a little bit about the personal is political. Let me just see. There we go. So the personal is political is like quite a prominent concept in the feminist movement. It came actually out of the student movement and second wave feminism in the 1960s. And it really underscores the connections between personal experience and larger social and political structures. And in the context of the 1960s and 1970s, it really came forward from the challenging the idea that the nuclear family and family values were only personal issues, but the feminist movement said they are actually political issues, and they are really spaces where politics plays out. So what they basically said is the restriction of women to the private sphere is a political issues. And political issues also affect the private sphere. So they are very connected. And I want to get back to this, the personal is political, a couple of times during today's conversation, because I think it really holds a key to concrete strategies to involving men for gender and social justice. The next slide, please. So I talk a little bit about MenEngage Alliance. It's the organization that I co-lead. Rather than an organization, it's actually a network. It's a social change network. And we are membership based, and I'll share a little bit more about that later. But what we unite around is to end patriarchal power, protect human rights, and achieve gender justice and social justice for everyone. Next slide, please. So what that means for us is that we center on transforming unequal power relations and patriarchal systems. And we do that in a number of ways. So one of them is, and that's the second point, working with men and boys through intersectional feminist approaches. So we mobilize men and boys all around the world to address unequal power dynamics, unequal privileges, and to advance the feminist cause, which I just shared about, having a social just society for everyone. And then the first point is around transforming patriarchal masculinity. So masculinity being, what does it mean to be a man in society? What is considered acceptable? What is considered the right kind of behavior for men? And what we challenge is the way those currently are shaped around what we call patriarchal masculinity. So the stereotype is men cannot show emotions, men have to use violence and dominance over others, they have to suppress others in order to climb up into the social hierarchy. So that kind of masculinities, which is also actually displayed by women, it's a concept that affects all of us. That's what we are trying to challenge, and we're trying to promote alternatives of more caring and healing forms of masculinities, of what it means to be men. And we build inclusive alliances, local to regional to global. We have local membership in many countries, and also at the regional level and at the global level, we organize ourselves. And one of the key things we do as MenEngage Alliance, so we work to mobilize men, and there are many men in my team, and I work with many men, is that we always work in partnerships with women's rights, gender, and other social justice movements. We don't go to do these kind of things alone, because that would be a lack of accountability and a potential risk of reinforcing actually male power. So this alliance building is really important for us. And if you could show the next slide, Mirna. So this is the network, what we look like. I thought it would be helpful for you to know. We have over 1,000 member organizations all around the world. They are civil society organizations. And we are in more than 88 countries. And we're also organized in networks. So Europe, for example, has a regional MenEngage network. There's a MenEngage Europe network. And there's also member organizations doing work at the country level. Yeah, and we basically at the global level bring everybody together to challenge issues at the global level, and we support the local memberships to do their work. Next slide, please. So now I really wanted to invite you in and just to take a moment to think about what makes an activist, or if maybe an activist is too big of a word, what made you be here today? What makes you interested in the topic of EDI? What makes you want to spend your time on it? So just give that a moment, like what made you as a person be here today and want to be here today. And if you could show the next slide, Milena. So very often what we actually hear, and there's research has been done about this, and it applies to me personally, is that very often it's a combination of personal experiences and seeing injustices in the world, whether to others or the world at large. No? So having personal experience of experiencing discrimination or any kind of injustice, whether it's on the basis of gender, or sexual orientation, gender identity, age, race. Very often for people, they become motivated to do something about the injustices in the world because of personal experience, or the personal experiences of people close to us, our brothers, our sisters, our friends, our parents, basically anybody close to us that we see something unjust happens to them and it makes you angry, upset, and you want to do something about it. Or a combination of those, and you see issues, injustices in the larger world, whether, you know, through the news or in society. So those kind of motivations to want to work on gender equality, on social justice, that those apply to men as well. And we see that with many men that we work with, that those kind of hold the key to want to become involved in EDI issues. If you could show the next slide, Milena. So again, you see it's kind of that combination of the personal and the political coming together to motivate people to want to do something. All right. Next slide. So now I want to share a bit concretely about how to engage men, whether that's in your own institution, you know, where you work, or whether it's any of the work that we are doing. These are some of the things that we see our own member organizations applying, and that works really well. So one of them is, again, it's the entry point of the personal. There are many organizations that go into local communities and they organize men's or institutions, actually, for that matter, workplaces, and they organize men's circles and talking groups. So bringing men together to talk about these issues. And that very often it's just very basic, simple questions that can get the conversation going to make people, and to make, in this case, men, see that gender equality, social justice issues are their own personal issues as well. They're not only issues out there, they're personal. So questions that they get asked is, what's the first time you experienced you were a boy or a girl, or neither, in the cases of, for some people. Who was a role model for you when you were growing up? Did you have any male role models? You know, what kind of behaviors and principles did they instill on you? What do you do when you experience strong emotions, when you feel sad, when you're angry, when you're frustrated? For many men, the answers are, well, you know, I acted out on somebody else, or I don't talk about it with anyone. So these are kind of conversation openers to say, well, for men, you can also talk about your emotions with your friends. You can, you know, express your sadness. In a lot of cultures, I think that it applies in Europe as well, being able to express sadness through crying, for example, is really not done for many men. So just having conversation around that and opening up pathways to get connected with one's own emotions and to be able to show them and get connected with other men and talk about these things can be really helpful. And then I think one of the key things we're now seeing with boys and young men, especially in schools, is to ask them, who do you follow on social media? And you may have seen this in the news, or maybe even know it from family and friends around you. There's quite some misogynist, very harmful men on the internet, whether it's Instagram or YouTube or TikTok, and they actually attract a lot of young men, and these guys say really harmful things. So we're really seeking to have conversations with young men and boys about who are your role models online, who inspire you, and try to prevent that they follow kind of the wrong people. But also we believe there's a need underneath that. You know, why do young people start following older people or any people that express harmful thoughts and principles? There's a need, we believe, underneath that, for connection or for making sense in the world. So by trying to make the young men also see what their own needs are, we seek to kind of help them into a different direction. And next slide, please. So then the next I wanted to share is kind of the interpersonal thing. So we talked about men's groups now, but what we think is really important is that it can never stop there, because it's about building empathy also for other people's experiences. So if we bring men only together, only talking with men, in a way, it's only the beginning of the understanding of what these same questions actually mean for people who are, well, for women, for queer identified people, for gay people, very often, you know, for people of color or Black people, in the case of when we're talking about cisgender white men. So kind of trying to understand what are other people's experiences like. So again, we ask in groups of men and women together. Sometimes they are men and women that are partners, but sometimes it's like in the workplace, for example, just colleagues, bringing them together and asking again the question, what's the first time you experienced you were gendered? And then the really crucial one is, what is it like for you to walk on the street alone when it's dark? Like, it's really been eye-opening how many men actually do not know how challenging it is for women to be in any public space, how much kind of outright risk of harassment or worse we experience. But this even applies in the workplace, no? So just asking questions and sharing with each other, what's it like to be you in certain spaces, is really eye-opening. Yeah, and then the microaggressions part is, I think, maybe what applies even more in the work space. Next slide. Great. So what Milena also shared was, oh no, actually this, I got this from a blog from you, Milena, I hope you don't mind. It was a quote that really struck me. She said that, I believe that the best way to avoid bias of any sort is to be aware of it. Once you are aware that certain situations make you bias prone, you will learn to think twice about what you say and how you react. And I believe that that's really very true. And so one of the key things that we then seek to do as MenEngage Alliance is to find ways to make people aware. At the same time, the truth is that, and Milena quotes this in her blog post, there's a study by the United Nations that say that 90% of all people hold a bias towards women. So that means men, and that means women ourselves as well, you know, 90% of all people. What I want to say with that is that, but we hold bias, and I'll get back to that a little bit later as well, but it's how we grow up in society, we hold bias. So it's not about ignoring that, but it's about bringing it out into the open and acknowledging it. And so being able to, like, listening to other people's experiences is really one key way to raise awareness. But we want to connect that with being aware of one's own exercises and reflections of power and privilege. So for men in patriarchal society, whether as an individual man or not you experience that on a daily level, you hold power. That's what patriarchy does. For me as a white person, as a white woman, in the system of racism and white supremacy, I hold power. And so having conversations to bring that out in the open, to make it discussable, is really, really key. And so this is one of the key things that we do with MenEngage members, and we do it at the global level, is just to create these spaces and teach, so capacity strengthening on reflecting on one's own power and privileges, and together to create cultures where we can discuss these kind of things. So not ignore, and for me it's been really eye-opening, because I joined MenEngage Alliance 8 years ago, as a white woman from the global north, I'm from the Netherlands, in an international society, alliance that has a lot of members in the global south. And I thought, okay, I'm a woman and I come to be part of MenEngage Alliance to mobilize men. So it made me feel, very like I was bringing the feminist perspective into MenEngage Alliance as a woman. And I thought that was really very necessary. But I've learned to also over time that I'm also a white person in the Alliance. And the work that we do, reflecting on one's own power and privilege, making it discussable, like building friendship with the people around us in which we can be held to account when we act not in line with our principles. All of that has really helped me to see that I'm part of the system, and I'm not, how do you say it? I'm not some kind of good person that's outside all of it. It's inside me, and I have to work on dismantling these power inequalities every single day. And I think, I can imagine that working with the people that hold power in your institution, it's not an easy message, but I think for those of us who are interested in being part of the right side of history, as I call it, it's a personal, individual, transformative process that I really welcome everybody into, because I think really the change that we want to see in the world begins with ourselves. And so the work that we do with MenEngage Alliance, we frame it also around inner work for social change. So in order to see social change or transformation in the world, we also work on ourselves. Now, I want to share the next slide. Oh yeah, all right, I'll get to that in a bit. So now I wanted to problematize a little bit now the concept of men and boys that we've been talking about. So when we think about equality, diversity, and inclusion, very often, I think we actually talk about gender equality. But of course, it's broader than that. And when we think about how do we involve men in EDI, we have to also unpack that men are not a universal category, right? Not all men are the same. I think men do show up actually in many social justice movements. They show up in Black Lives Matter. I think they were, very active in the LGBTQI movement. Gay men are very active there. The climate change movement, there are many men active. So there are a lot of men active in social justice issues. But when it comes to gender issues, there is still that kind of challenge for, I think, cisgender men to step up. So again, making men see themselves that they're gendered, I think, is really powerful. But here, if you could show the next slide. All right. So this is just a little bit of theory. So I mentioned just earlier, like not all men and boys are the same. There is a civil rights advocate and scholar from the United States. Her name is Kimberly Crenshaw. She's a Black woman, and she really developed the concept of intersectionality. And it's become really prominent in our gender and social justice work, where she says intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it locks and intersects. And it's the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and privilege. Right, so we look, and on the right, you see some of the different kind of identities that we hold as people. And there are really interesting exercises that make you see, okay, I hold in all these systems, these intersecting systems of power, privilege, and oppression. I hold some that give me privilege, and I hold some that marginalize me. So yeah, for some, race is the main marginalizing factor, but being male would be like a privileging factor. And by doing these exercises and doing them in our workplaces, we can actually also understand and see people's experiences. And it can help to build empathy, because it's not about creating like a hierarchy of the suffering, like, okay, I am worse off than you. But if we do it well, then it's really about understanding that all of us are challenged by the same system in one way or the other, and some more than others. We have to acknowledge that. But you cannot just say, oh, there is patriarchy and gender injustice, and it's separate from the racial injustice issues. They all intersect and lead to people's experiences. So I think intersectionality in EDI is a key concept. All right, and I think I'll just leave it there also in the interest of time. If you could show the next slide, Milena. So what then, I think we just talked about the personal, the interpersonal, but at the end of the day, what we do in MenEngage Alliance is we say it's not enough to work only on our personal relationships and do our inner work. It's really about transforming the systems, the structures, and the institutions that lead to these inequalities and exclusion that we all suffer from. So I think here it's important to understand that I said that already. We all experience these inequalities. And it's what bell hooks has called the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. So all these systems, they interconnect. So the capitalist part is also the economic exclusion part. I think that's that we haven't talked much about today, but it's important to keep in mind. But when it comes to really transforming institutions such as the university and your own institute, I just wanted to share a couple of examples of things that can be done. And it's, I think, up to you to assess how far the Institute and the university have gotten with this. But a key one is to have policies in place that prevent and address any issues. So both prevention and responding to any issues when they come up are important. And you have to look at, I think, the Institute both as a place for education, so where people experience education, receive education, but also as a space of employment where people work. And at both of those levels, and there may be others, there need to be policies in place focused on prevention of harassment and exclusion, and focused on addressing issues when they do arise. So yeah, the second one is about response mechanisms, having a trust person or a department that people can go to, that everybody knows where that department is, that there is ongoing capacity strengthening and information sharing in the institution with the people to where they can go. So it needs to be policies and mechanisms in place, but they also need to be alive, and they need to be kept alive, and they need to be constantly communicated about. So that was actually the third point. It's crucial that the highest level in the organization or in the institute, the leadership is committed to these issues and shows leadership. I think that very often is a challenge, and I'll get to that a little bit, how we can maybe make the leadership see that it's an important issue for them. And then at the end of the day, I think it's about transformation of culture. I mentioned this a couple of times. It's how do you center humanity, and not just production or, presentations or getting the highest scores or however it works, but how do you center humanity and people's well-being? It's really interesting to me how, when maybe you ask some of the male high leadership in your institute, how they deal with emotions, etc. And they may have wonderful, relationships at home with their family or with good friends. Why not bring some of that safety into the institute, in the workplace, in the place where you spend, quite frankly, sometimes more time with the people in your workplace than you do with the people at home. So I think that's maybe one way to see, and if we can convince a cultural transformation within any kind of workplace or institution. If you could show the next slide. But another way, I think, to try and seek to convince people in leadership or anybody to be part of gender justice and social justice issues. Well, let me say that to be part of transforming and working towards improving the issues. It's just also to talk about what are the risks of not doing anything. I think to me, it's like, for especially to men who are not showing up and are not part of these conversations, I really want to say, hurry up because you're missing the boat. Society is changing, it's transforming. What was not talked about and tolerated only a few years back, sexual harassment, racism, it's not tolerated anymore today. And I think that's thanks to movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter and the climate justice movement as well, that society is really, really transforming. And it's so, yeah, so I think it's key for men to join the right side of history, as I said earlier. But at the same time, we're also seeing that there's huge polarization now. So I don't just want to sketch some kind of beautiful future where we're all moving into, harassment and racism not being tolerated anymore, because I also see that there is polarization, and that there's also in some sectors actually even more, a study that was just launched in Europe actually shows that young men under 30 have less gender equal attitudes than their older generation. So there's polarization, and there are people moving in the right direction. But so I think the only way we can deal with that is, again, making it personal, because I think that the young men who have less gender equal attitudes now, there's fear underneath it. There's fear of losing out, or there's frustrations underneath of not being heard. So again, like bringing that out into the open, creating spaces to talk about it, I think really are ways to make men part of the conversation. If you could show the next slide, Milena, and I'm getting towards the end of what I wanted to share with you today. I'm always reminded of this quote by Ban Ki-moon, who was the UN Secretary General a couple of years ago, about a decade ago. And he said basically that investing in girls and women's health and rights, it's not only the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do. And he put that more in an economic perspective. So basically, if you invest in gender equality, then the economy will grow, it will be better, even for those with an interest in gaining money. But I'm always reminded of this just as a call for really men not to miss the boat and to be part of this conversation and be part of the movement for change. Because, let me share one story. In the Netherlands, just a couple of, maybe 1 or 2 months ago, we have, and you may have the same in France, I'm not sure, but we have student sororities. So basically student organizations. And some of them are kind of quite traditional. So you have, it's one sorority, but they have male groups and female groups. And at about 2 months ago, one of these male groups had a meeting, and it was a closed meeting. No women were allowed, it was just not allowed to even share anything about what had happened inside with the rest of the world. And some of the male leaders, so these are guys that will probably, we're on the track to later become have high positions in banks or in government institutions, like kind of on a high career path. And some of these guys, they said the most horrendous things about women, like sexual harassment and just like really horrible things about women in that meeting. Probably because they thought they could get away with it. But it was actually filmed by some of the guys in the room, and they shared it outside. And within a day or two, it was a huge scandal in Dutch society. And the guys that had been expressing these harmful, misogynist things about women were removed from the sororities. Their names became public. And I think right now for those guys, it will be quite challenging actually to get a job anywhere, because there are not many institutions who would outright hire somebody who has a track record like that. So while I hope that somebody is helping those guys to heal and to see what the harms that they've done and to improve who they are and how they think, I do think that it's a warning sign in a way that society is changing. You can't say these kind of things anymore. And that you kind of get away with it. So it's also really for guys, I think, the smart thing to do, to really think about men's own roles in being part of transformation. And next slide, please. So for any of the men that are here or any of the men that you're engaging with, I wanted to just share some thoughts around how you can be an accomplice for gender and social justice, for equality, diversity, and inclusion, or how you can be an ally. It's about also starting these conversations about gender equality and any other kind of justice issues with your male peers, so your male friends, your male family members, your male fellow, your colleagues or people that you study with, and with the male leadership as well in the institution. Whenever you are in a space, create spaces for women to also talk. If you're seeing the dynamics, just hold back. Like sometimes stepping back is one of the best actions we can take to create spaces for others. And I'm saying women, but you can equally replace this with people of color. Anybody that you see is basically being marginalized in a specific context. Reflect on your own biased thoughts and actions. We talked about that quite a bit today. Be an active bystander. When you see something, when you hear something, say something. Call the person out who's being an ass or who is harassing, or and always check in with the person who's experienced the harassment, what they would want to happen. Really important step. Take action and initiative on establishing policies and procedures, and hold your leadership to account for their commitment and action or their lack thereof. So if you would go to the leadership and say, we need policies, we need procedures, we're looking at you and we're going to keep following you until you do it, that is a part of holding leadership to account. And I think that's a really important role we can all play, and really calling in men and boys to join. Last slide, just my last thoughts I wanted to share, that this is really about an invitation to men. Because being part of gender and social justice work is such an opportunity to grow as a person, in your connection with others. It's really an opportunity to be more human. And lastly, I wanted to end with a quote, and it's the last slide, if you could show that. This is a quote that we use a lot in MenEngage Alliance. In our work, we center accountable practices. So we do a lot of capacity strengthening on how you can be more accountable. Basically, just briefly defining accountability is about taking action to address personal and institutional practices that go against our principles of gender equality and human rights, to be critically aware of one's own power and privilege and be open to criticism, to always acknowledge any harm caused by our actions and take actions to make amends, to respect and promote women's leaderships in the gender equality movement, and to create structures of consultation and partnership with women's rights organizations. So that's a lot of the work that we do, is around strengthening our membership and ourselves to be accountable in the work that we do. And we very often use this quote that I want to share with all of you again as an invitation to be part of this movement. It's by Maya Mingus. She's a queer writer and educator and trainer for transformative justice and disability justice from the Caribbean and North America. And in her blog, Dreaming Accountability, she wrote, "What if our accountability wasn't something we ran from, but something we ran towards and we desired, appreciated, and held as sacred? What if we took accountability as precious opportunities to practice liberation, to practice love, to practice the kinds of people, elders to be, and souls we really want to be?" And with that, I want to end the part I wanted to share with you today, and I'm really looking forward to any questions you may have, any thoughts you may want to share.